Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Institute of Juan de Mariana. Today it's obviously a special day because normally we wouldn't have any conference on Holy Friday, but we have had the almost unique opportunities of presenting and having here Deirdre McCloskey, and I think it's such a great opportunity and such a great honor to have here with us such renowned economist and historian, especially in the classical libertarian tradition, and providing us with, I would say, a wholly new perspective on how to defend and how to advocate for liberalism, which of course has many connections with the rest of the traditions every one of us comes from, but in a sense, and I think she will agree, provides liberalism with a human face, a human soul that many times is lacking in our defenses. So again, it's such a great pleasure to have you here, and well, welcome to the Institute.
Thank you very much, dear. I'm glad to be here. I've been to Barcelona a lot, and I know there's some football rivalry that I shouldn't get into. But I haven't been much to here, but I have been to the Prado and so forth. And my mom came and she stayed in Madrid for a week and went to the Prado every morning when it opened and stayed all day. So I think in the family we've got a lot of experience. I am an economist by training. I was educated at Harvard as an undergraduate and a graduate in economics, but at the time, the kind of economics that was on offer at Harvard was Keynesianism. And if not Keynesianism, then some sort of social engineering. I'm from the government and I'm here to help you, was kind of the mentality. And I think it's deep in the traditions of economics for about the last 100 years. Before that, economists weren't that way. They were more social critics than sort of positive engineers of the economy. But of course, since then, the size of government has gotten to be much larger. In 1910, all levels of government, local up to federal, United States spent about 7.5% of national income. Now they spend 35%. And of course, in France, well over 50%. Henry Kissinger says France is the only successful communist country. So there is a assumption in economics that the government will do it, that there should be many, many policies. And I don't think so. I don't think government policy is the way forward. And I certainly don't think we got rich because of governments. After all, most of the time, certainly in my own country, government has been an obstacle to economic growth, an actual obstacle, such as in segregation in the South, or immigration restriction from the 1920s on, or professional licenses, which have grown and grown in the United States in the last half century, as I imagine they have here. And if it's not actually stopping free exchange and discouraging people from trying out things, the government has misdirected things. Ideas that might be in some small way desirable, or maybe not, like canals. In the United States, there was a big canal boom in the 1830s, and vast amounts were spent on canals on the eve of the railway. And as is happening increasingly in our days, technology overtakes the decision of the government. In Spain, I think I can say without fear of contradiction that high-speed rail was a big mistake. I just came on the high-speed rail from Barcelona. It's very nice. It goes at almost 300 kilometers an hour. Hey, good, that's nice for me. But it's not ever going to pay. And the line that goes from Madrid to the Prime Minister's hometown is going to have even less traffic. So if you're asking the question, why are we rich? A lot of people assume, our friends on the left or in the center, and even many of our friends on the right, if they're conservatives, assume that government, the nation state, planning, industrial policy is one thing we call regulation. Well, you've got to have regulation, don't you? You can't just have people making trades with each other. That would be terrible. That's kind of the grounding assumption. And I'd like to start showing you this afternoon. If you want to get the full picture, you've got to read all 1,700 pages of my trilogy, of which this is the third volume. I was going to write 4 volumes, but if a trilogy might be considered somewhat self-indulgent, a tetralogy is an abomination. You should be stoned to death if you write a tetralogy. So I restrained myself and made a very thick book, even thicker than the others, as the third volume. And the first volume I wrote, which has been translated into Spanish, by the way, by El Fondo in Mexico. And they're probably, I think they're going to translate all 3 volumes eventually, which will be nice. But in the first volume, it was called The Bourgeois Virtues, Ethics for an Age of Commerce. And what I was doing in that book was writing what the Greeks called an apology for capitalism. By apology, I meant, of course, not, I'm sorry, gee, we made a terrible mistake adopting capitalism. No. I was saying, apology in Greek means a defense. And the defense was mainly ethical. Because if there's anything central to socialism, it's the claim that capitalism, free exchange, is unethical, that it's evil. The other Marx, Groucho Marx, the great movie comedian of the 1930s, had a somewhat cruel sense of humor. And at the height of his fame in movies, Groucho was making a lot of money. A friend of his who was a communist, as lots of people were, I probably would have been a communist in the 30s, came to Groucho and said, a friend of his said, Groucho, I'm out of a job. I've really got to have some income. Can you find me a job in Hollywood? And Groucho sent him away. He said, George, I wouldn't want to exploit you. And sent him away, weeping. So that volume was aimed at that problem, the problem of people thinking of markets as corrupting, as resulting in ethical failure. It's very appropriate. I'm a Christian myself, and speaking on Good Friday about this, and feels good to me. And I approach the whole question of whether what we call capitalism, ill-advisedly I must say, but what we call capitalism is ethical or unethical. And I said what is, I think, kind of obvious actually, not just to us, but if you have any sense, it's obvious to anyone. Socialism can create people who are terrible. 70 years of the Soviet experience created a society where envy is one of the main sort of mental diseases that people have. They're envious about everyone, even about other countries. And, medieval life under feudalism had good points, but bad points too. As Don Quixote shows. So I made the case in virtue ethical terms. It's a way of thinking about ethics. It wasn't so bad. And then it occurred to me that actually I was approaching, through this gate of ethics, I was approaching the central question of economics, which, as the blessed Adam Smith said, is the nature and causes of the wealth of nations. How does it happen? How did we get so rich? What is going on here? And I think it was good that I had to approach it as from an ethical point of view, because if we got rich and lost our immortal souls, I would be a socialist. If that's what resulted from becoming wealthy, and many of our conservative friends feel the same way. They feel that we should have a traditional society with subordination, and people should be in their place, and that it's very dangerous to get rich. That makes you, that corrupts you, and so on. So there, and I, if I thought that was true, I wouldn't be a liberal. But I don't think it's true. I don't think we've corrupted ourselves. So then you move on, having established that it's not a catastrophe, ethically, this capitalism, then you start thinking, well, why? And what I ended up concluding goes back to the ethics in a way. Not in a way, in a very serious way. So volume 2, called Bourgeois Dignity. Now here's the subtitle. Why economics does not explain the modern world. Now, I'm a Chicago school economist. I'm actually drifting towards Austrian economics in the final act. But in any case, I'm a Chicago school economist. I like numbers. I like supply and demand curves. I mean, they're really beautiful. And, supply and demand curves, they're so nice. And they're sweet. And I wanted to see if the other ways that people have explained the enrichment of the modern world made sense. And it's my job. I'm an economic historian by scientific description. That's what I teach, and that's what I should be making contributions to. And without really knowing it, I had finally come to the conclusion, and then in the book I wrote it out and told you about it, that none of the explanations make any sense. There are basically two kinds of explanations. From the left, we're rich because we exploit people, right? We're rich because the third world is poor. We're rich because we exploit the working class. We're rich because we've exploited people. Britain is rich because of the empire. And it's very easy to show that that's false. That it's quantitatively extremely implausible. I mean, think about it. If you wanted to get rich in a hurry, would you steal from the homeless people in your neighborhood? Would you find the poorest people you can and then conquer them? No, you'd invade France. That's how to get rich. You'd also get some very good bread. So exploitation doesn't work, and I don't want to just throw it away as though it's just stupid, because a lot of very intelligent people, who in some ways I admire, have believed this sort of thing. But if you look into the economics of it very carefully, it doesn't work. From the conservative end of the standard spectrum, the argument is that virtuous capitalists started saving more. Max Weber did talked this way, and so did Marx, and so did the blessed Adam Smith. Saving was the source of riches. And this is, I really do love Adam Smith. I taught at Erasmus University in Rotterdam. I taught the theory of moral sentiments in the philosophy department there, and I just dote on Adam Smith. By the way, he wouldn't get tenure at a serious university these days. He only wrote 2 books, and that's disgraceful. You've got to write more than that if you're going to be a full professor. But in any case, he started the capital accumulation idea. And the very word capitalism, which of course he didn't invent, Marx didn't use the word capitalism, but he used capitalist, and then his followers called it ismus, and we were off to the races. But he said that it's the accumulation of capital that makes you rich. And this is wrong. This is mistaken. Now, there's a sense, there's a short-run sense, and in a small way, it's true. Madrid would be better off, I don't know, if more was spent on, I don't know, superhighways or something, maybe. If you just piled capital on Madrid, that would make it somewhat better off. But the problem is that the magnitude of the enrichment that we're talking about is a factor of 30. In 1800, the world, on average, except for a few lords and priests, earned about $3 a day. Imagine getting along today in Madrid. It's in modern prices. This isn't about inflation. This is real goods and services. There are still countries in the world that get along, don't get along very well, but do subsist on $3 a day. That was human fate since the caves. Agriculture increased population and made civilization possible, so I'm all for it, but didn't increase the material welfare of ordinary people. Because there were more people, diminishing returns to land set in, the stationary bandits called lords took the rent, and that, so our ancestors, I take it there are no Habsburg descendants here. I don't see any Habsburg chins. So I take it we're all the descendants of peasants. I certainly am. And our ancestors were unspeakably poor, extremely poor. And now, Spaniards, $100 a day in the same terms. Factor of 30. The United States, $130 a day. Luxembourg, 160. Norway, the land of some of my ancestors. Half of my ancestors were Irish, 1/4 were Norwegians. So my Norwegian ancestors undoubtedly went to Ireland, as they did, and enslaved some of my Irish ancestors. So to whom do I apply for reparations? It's a deep puzzle, deep metaphysical puzzle. But they earn about $150 a day. And Norwegians were unusually poor in 1800. And you can't explain that with just piling up capital. The capital can't be the initiating factor. It can't be the real cause. As Keynes said, the hero of my youth, Marx was the first hero, and then Keynes. He said, the return on capital can be brought to zero in a generation or so if there's no innovation, if there are no new ideas of what to do with the capital, and all you're doing is piling it on, there are diminishing returns. And you're never going to get anything close to a factor of 30 that way. So the basic structure of economics, both from the left and socialism and from the right, this kind of, this accumulation idea, both of them depend on accumulation. Accumulation's not it. In fact, the very word capitalism is an irritating scientific mistake, because it suggests that capital is the initiating force. Now look, it's necessary. If there are any capitalists in the room, I applaud you, and I want you to help find good ideas and put your money behind them. That's what made us rich, is the new ideas. Big pieces of plate glass, impossible in the 18th century. Look, it's all around us. This wood was cut with bandsaws, which weren't invented until the early 19th century in Sweden. Television, electric lights, central heating, which seems to be inadequate here. The antibiotics, and then just organizational changes that weren't about mechanical or biological breakthroughs of any sort. Containerization is a very big one. It was invented in 1956 by an owner of a trucking firm in North Carolina. It didn't involve any science, but it involved cheap steel, which had been invented about 100 years before. We got cheap steel, so let's make boxes. Make them of standard size, make them so they'll fit on a truck, a lorry, and then maybe we can even pile them up on ships and send them to China. And now we have container ships with 8,000 or 10,000 containers. So organizational changes, the invention of the modern university, 1810, the University of Berlin, is the first university that combines research with teaching in a serious way. It's a German invention. Kerosene was invented in Hungary. Kind of unusual, but it was. Et cetera, et cetera. So why then these new ideas? Human beings had always been somewhat ingenious, inventing the wheel and so on. Why not? Why did the industrial, not the Industrial Revolution, that's not the key here. The key here is the subsequent Great Enrichment. Because the conventional Industrial Revolution, say 1760 to 1860, or 1840, something like that, this kind of development had happened before. It had happened in the Renaissance in Italy, in industrial improvements of cloth and other things. 5th century Athens was based on great commercial success, organizational and mechanical, indeed, inventions that made commerce more efficient, which was why the Greeks were all over the Mediterranean. So, why not earlier? Why not in China? That's the big challenge. In 1492, you would have been crazy not to bet on China. China had the rule of law. China had immense internal markets with no tariffs, internal tariffs. Whereas, as you know, Europe was riven with tariffs then and until well into the 19th century. Peace. This is a concept that the Europeans didn't understand, much less experience. They fought all the time. And you can't get economic progress in the middle of a civil war or in the middle of the 30 Years' War. 1/3 of the population of Germany died in the 30 Years' War. So why not? And the science in China was best, as we've learned in the last half century or so. Before we thought, oh, the Chinese, they were just primitive, and we had science, we were so smart in Europe. No, that's nonsense. Chinese science was better than European science in 1492. Its foreign commerce was better before the Portuguese started saying, we must sail. So why not? And I think the answer is what happened in Britain in the 18th century and in other places in Europe in the 19th century, and that is liberalism. It's the idea of equality among people, not French-style equality, where you redistribute income after it's been earned, but equality of opportunity, opening up, not having tariffs, not having protection, not having regulation, not having entry restrictions to occupations. Let people have a go, as the British say. We don't use that phrase in the United States. Let people have a go. And I claim that that's the magic ingredient. That's what makes people in, let's sort of pause while this happens. It's this, and by the way, I've tested this argument, my volumes, but it's testable further. You can go into the biographies of individual inventors. You can look at what the obstacles to progress were in earlier times and watch carefully how they change in the 18th century and especially in the 19th. And you can see people getting much more ingenious. So there was an astonishing explosion of innovation after 1800. And you can do it yourself. The ballpoint pen, invented in, of all places, Argentina. The ballpoint pen, we all have, scores, dozens, in my case, about 100 ballpoint pens all over my house. And they're just one invention after another. As my friend Matt Ridley says, ideas started having sex. And then they had baby ideas, and grandbaby ideas, and great-grandbaby, and it's just, Matt says it's from trade. And that's quite wrong, because we've traded since the caves. We've always traded. People trade. Now, it's true that it became somewhat more intense in the 18th century, but, more intense isn't a qualitative change. What did change is the attitude towards human hierarchy. It was no longer that you were a milkmaid, you there in the corner. You're a milkmaid, shut up, you're a milkmaid. You are a plowman, that's your job. You're a pastore, a herdsman. That went away. It slowly. It's not as if liberalism burst on the scene full blown. In fact, 100 years before, say 1776, which is a emblematic year in many ways for the coming of liberalism in Europe and its offshoots, 100 years before, it was crazy to think that people were equal. I don't mean they're actually equal. Most of the people in this room are smarter than I am, but that doesn't bother me, and I'm willing to trade with you so that your greater intelligence can be good for me and for you simultaneously. But that's the point. In the older hierarchy, you were stuck wherever you were, and there was contempt for trade, contempt for innovation, indeed. In English, I'd be interested to know how it is in Spanish. In English, the very word innovation was a bad word until the 19th century. In fact, until well into the 19th century. You can look at this in the great Oxford English Dictionary. I'm almost sure there's a Spanish equivalent of the Oxford English Dictionary, which gives the history of each word in the language and how it slowly changed. And this is the case. All the quotations in the Oxford English Dictionary before the middle of the 19th century on the word innovation are, it's a bad thing. Oh, don't innovate. That would disturb the hierarchy. That would create disequilibriums. No, we don't want that. We want the great chain of being. And that's characteristic of all agricultural societies. Hunter-gatherer societies were egalitarian, but not agricultural societies. So that's what changed. And as I said, look here, there's a man named Rumboldt, Richard Rumboldt, who was executed by James II in 1685 for something that James, who was a tyrant, didn't want. And this man had been a leveler in the English Revolution of the 1640s. And these levelers were regarded as crazy. They wanted everyone to be equal. What a nutty idea. And under English law, Rumboldt was allowed to give a speech from the scaffold before they hung him. And he said, I think no man born of God is, I think no man born of God is born above another. For no man comes into the world with a saddle on his back, and no man booted and spurred to ride him. Now the crowd gathered to watch his execution undoubtedly thought this was pretty funny, because in 1685, no one believed it, except a few crazies. Our forefathers and mothers of the liberal character. In the Society of Friends, the Quakers, even women could speak. But they were a tiny group. So there was this beginning, and then it developed for various reasons that I don't entirely understand in the 18th century. And by the 19th century, in many countries, it was dogma. And my point is that this is a scientific hypothesis about how people are inspirited to innovate. If you're not allowed to, you don't innovate. Or, to put it another way, and this is quite important, if the society looks down on innovation and detests merchants and thinks in sort of a peasant way that every merchant is a cheater and a liar and the bosses are all bad, then no one will go into those fields. Well, no one will, someone has to. But the way to honor and wealth will be through the court or the battlefield or the church. Period. In Molière's play, Le Bourgeois Gentilhomme, this fool who wants to have his daughter marry a gentilhomme, a gentleman, he doesn't get it. He doesn't know that trade is permanently dishonorable. In Spain and France, if a nobleman, or woman for that matter, engaged in trade, they suffered derogation, which meant that their patent of nobility was taken away from them. Now that didn't mean that noble men and women didn't want more money. You bet they did. But to actually do anything for it, instead of waiting for the rents to come in, was considered below the dignity of a noble person. And many other people in the society had pretensions to this sort of workless nobility. In fact, almost to the 20th century, maybe into it in some circles, in English, in England, a gentleman was a person without an occupation. And to have an occupation was considered, you can see it happening in the 19th century. It changes. Now in the United States, it was never quite this way. Southern slave owners fancied themselves English gentlemen in this way, but they worked as merchants all the time, and they were very busy managing their farms. So even they were not gentlemen in this sense. So that's what happened. My claim, and there's a lot more work to be done. If there are any PhD students here, you can make your fortune by showing I'm wrong or showing I'm right in the matter of liberalism as being the key. In short, liberalism is what made us rich. Letting my people, the old spiritual said, let my people go, Moses, let my people go. When we let people go and let them have a go, then we got fantastic innovation. When we don't do that, even now, we suppress innovation. Look, innovation comes from people, right? It doesn't come from science, which is my friend Joel Mokyr believes. It doesn't come from trade, as some of my colleagues in economic history think. The great trading ocean of the 17th and 18th century was not the Atlantic Ocean, it was the Indian Ocean. And yet the countries, the Arab traders, vigorously going back and forth across the Indian Ocean, they didn't have an industrial revolution. As I told you, Chinese science was superior to European science, and that didn't cause an industrial revolution. And indeed, although science is very important now in our economic welfare, still a vast amount of what we do is not science-based at all. The blue jeans that so many people here are wearing. Did you know that the denim cloth that makes the blue jeans is from the French town Nîmes, de Nîmes. That's where it comes from. And this innovation of simplifying your clothing by only wearing blue jeans, which I do when I'm not giving speeches, isn't quite minor, but I don't know, I think it's pretty good, pretty nice. And that's got nothing to do with science. Nothing at all. I gave you the example of containerization. And there are hundreds and hundreds of these. Mechanical innovations in general are not based on science. If you've ever watched one of these programs where they show how something's made, you have these fantastic factories. I've only seen one or two of them in my life, where these machines are taking bottles and turning them upside down and throwing them to the ceiling and moving them around and by the millions and blah, blah, blah. And out comes the product by the caseload. That's mechanical engineering. It's not rocket science, express it that way. So it's not science until very recently. So it's being free that makes us rich. Now, if all freedom did was make us free, I'd be in favor of it. if it didn't have this economic effect, I'd still be in favor of it. Because I think the free life, the life of a free person, is a fulfilled human life. Whether you continue being a hunter-gatherer or a peasant or whatever, if you're a free person. And freedom, I must insist, and we could talk about it if you don't agree, freedom should be defined as freedom from other people bossing you around, compelling you. We often have bosses if we're employees, but you know, as the American movie said, we can take this job and shove it. We may be poor, we may have to go, the only alternative may be breaking rocks, but we're not slaves. The notion of wage slavery is pernicious. It's not a sensible analysis. Slaves are slaves. If you don't behave, you get beaten. You're forced to do things physically. And that's not how to get innovation, but it's also not a dignified human life. But thank God, liberalism also enriched us. And it enriched us so much that it's very irritating when people say, no, it's the accidents of the scientific revolution, or no, it's government policy. We call it, in American history, the 19th century, it's called internal improvements, which means jobs for the boys. It's very annoying because that's not what it is. As I said before, innovation is innovated by folks, by people, by individuals. There's an argument that the great economist Joseph Schumpeter made in 1942, that we've reached a point where great industrial laboratories just generate innovations. But you know, even in great industrial laboratories, it's individuals freed from dependence on other human beings. Not dependence, that's not quite the word, but under the thumb of other human beings, as women were universally in older societies. That's where the innovations come from. My mother had a friend who was an inventor and a professor at MIT. And this guy just invented stuff. And he retired. He helped my mother with her book of poetry instead. And they kept calling him up and saying, George, would you come back to innovate? And George said, no, not interested. I want to help Helen McCloskey with her poetry. And that's what a free person can choose. And so, though he was in a big institution, MIT or this industrial laboratory he worked for, you know, they said to him, look, George, come back. We'll give you a lab, access to all the equipment. Do what you want. Because they knew that he was a creative person, an engineer, who would just sort of think, no, let's see, what should I do today? Oh yeah, let's invent the internet. And he'd do that kind of thing. So it's free people who make for a rich society. I don't have all that much more to say because I've essentially summarized the three books. I've shown you, I haven't shown you, I've just indicated that I don't believe the conventional explanations, and I've told you roughly why I don't. It's not, for example, coal. People say, again, Matt Ridley loves coal. And yeah, coal's important, but come on, Matt, you don't get anything out of the coal unless you invent a steam engine. Time out, Matt. If you just pour coal on a society, that doesn't make it rich. And indeed, the Chinese were exploiting coal thousands of years, literally 2,000 years, maybe somewhat more actually, before the Northern Europeans got onto coal. Actually, the Romans used coal too. So it's quite tiresome to deal with these little effects that my economist and economic historian friends. Ah, yes, the corporate form, the corporation, institutional change. Aha, that does it. No, it doesn't. General incorporation was brought to most countries in Europe and the United States in the middle of the 19th century. It mostly wasn't taken up until about 40 years later. And then it wasn't by any means universal. Partnerships continued to be the dominant business form for a long time afterwards. So the corporate form's nice. I have no particular objection to it, but it's not what it doesn't come close. Even if you add up all these little causes, you don't get 3,000% increase. Earlier enrichments in human history, which there have been a number, for instance, the invention in the Western Mediterranean of the oil and wheat economy that was the basis for Greek society. That invention, suppose it doubled the income of ordinary people in the Greek and Phoenician world. Well, doubling is 100%. Our job is to explain 3,000%. And the only way we're going to you can't keep picking up little pieces of the thing and saying, that's the crucial thing. These things are often necessary, but they're not ever sufficient. What's sufficient is getting masses of people inspired. And a free society does that. The great danger, I think, in the modern world is the conviction that's grown yearly since the First World War that the state owes us a living, that the state will provide, that we're rich because the state is giving us money. And one way it gives the money, you were telling me earlier, is printing it and handing it out to its friends. About Venezuela. So that's a danger. As you know, there's an illiberal counter-revolution worldwide from the Philippines to the United States. I was just in Hungary, and this guy Orban, I think, is going to win the next election. Actually, interesting, he started as a liberal, and his big bête noire is his Soros, or Soros, as they say in Hungarian, Soros. And what's funny about that is that this guy, Orban, got a fellowship to go to Oxford from George Soros. He tries to keep that quiet. So that's my view. And so, as you said, this is another string in our bow of persuasions to our friends on the left and right that liberalism, which doesn't have to do with this left-right continuum of how to use the massive violence of the state, and instead says, let's not use it. As much as we have to use it some, but as much as we can, let's get away from using the violence of the state and let my people go and let them innovate. If you let them trade and you let them, they'll innovate. People do. If liberalism reigns. So that's my views. Those are my views, and welcome to them. Let's have a discussion about it. I have to practice my court curtsy in anticipation of the Nobel Prize. Fat chance, as we say in the United States.
Any questions?
Well, thanks, Deirdre, for the talk. Well, I always...
Is it on? It doesn't seem like it's on.
It is?
It is on. Good. Okay.
Okay, well, thanks. Well, I don't agree often with your ideas, but anyways, I really admire your intellectual coherence,
Yes.
your personal, braveness and example,
No, we all need courage here.
and also above all, your sense of humor. So, okay, my question here, and I come back to maybe your previous point on the role of institutions in explaining the Great Enrichment. So what I got from your books, which I read, and your
He's a man of taste.
and your talk now, is that this idea of equality of opportunity made people go right,
Yeah,
and just
have a go.
starting to innovate in many ways. How this key idea that you in a very legitimate way you sell as your hypothesis
Yes.
and your main thesis relates with this newer idea that we have been listening in the last 20 years about inclusive institutions and expanding the diversity and the numbers of people taking decisions
Sure.
in the public, in the economic, in
Yeah.
the social realm. So how would you draw the distinction between your hypothesis and what Acemoglu and Robinson have been saying for the last 20 years?
It's not Acemoglu and Robinson. It's North and Weingast.
Yeah.
Let's not forget. Let's not get our intellectual history confused here. But yeah, okay. Yeah, you're right. Robinson and Acemoglu say this, and it's become very fashionable. At the World Bank, they've become converts, and now at the World Bank, instead of what Bill Easterly calls capital fundamentalism, where you just pour money on Ghana, and it gets, of course, Ghana's going to do really well because Nkrumah's in charge. That's going to be great. You pour money into Ghana, and of course it'll get rich. And you don't give the damn red Chinese, as we used to call them, a cent, and they continue to be poor. How did that work out? I need to point out. Now the World Bank says institutions. It was convinced by Doug North. And so they want to pour institutions in. They want to pour stuff. They want to engineer societies. So if you want English law, you provide the lawyers with wigs, white wigs and gowns, and then you'll get English law. I don't think so, on a great number of grounds, which as you know, I argue in the books. The fundamental thing that's wrong with the institutional idea is that it ignores ethics. Now, of course, if you define social ethics as, or the ethics people have, we don't have to call it social, the ethics people have as an institution, then of course you've said that society causes society, which is not a very interesting scientific hypothesis. Probably it does. Aside from climate, society causes society. But if you narrow institutions to what they mean, which is basically laws or constitutions, those are dead letters, we say in English. You must have a similar Spanish expression, unless people believe in them. Look, the Soviet Constitution is a beautiful document. Go read the Soviet Constitution. It's wonderful, and it's liberal. You know, aside from ownership of the means of production, it's liberal, right? But it wasn't carried out. That's one of the basic problems. Then there's some really terrible problems of timing. Doug North and Barry Weingast, they're nice people. I like them. I have a very embarrassing story about eating with Barry in Chile a few months ago, but I'm not going to tell it. It's so horrible. Such a faux pas on my part. But anyway, they're nice people. They're excellent scholars, I guess, but they get all the timing wrong. They say The rule of law came to Britain or actually England in particular, in 1689, the Glorious Revolution. Well, this is loco. This is insane. English law of property and contract was developed in the Middle Ages and worked when they weren't having a civil war, as, alas, they rather frequently did. But English law is very old, and then, if you don't like that, Roman law was older. So it's this law stuff that's suddenly coming upon people. And then it takes, mysteriously, a century for this law to pay off. I mean, if the law was such a constraint, and a few changes, very minor changes, in the laws of England in 1689, except for the matter of the king versus parliament, those minor changes are supposed to have caused the second largest secular change in human history. The first one is the agricultural revolution. And on Good Friday, I emphasized there was a non-secular event of great importance. But anyway, the second big secular event is the Great Enrichment. So I just think this institution stuff is in a way superficial. Now, I've had a dispute with Barry Weingast on this very question in that famous journal to which I'm sure you all subscribe, the Scandinavian Economic History Review. I take it everyone has a subscription here. And if you look back on the issues of, I think it was last year, you'll see an article I wrote, which I entitled somewhat aggressively, "New Institutionalism is Not Yet a Scientific Success." I added the "yet" as a kind of concession to maybe they'll get it right someday. So I don't think as I say in the title of this book, how ideas, say the idea in particular, this master idea of liberalism, not capital or institutions, enrich the world. So, I don't expect you to, if you've read my books, you've heard most of these arguments. You've heard all of them before. Maybe you need to reread. No, I can understand. I can tell you that the scholarship of Robinson and Acemoglu is a little unsteady. Now, they're both fine scholars, I'm sure, and Acemoglu is bound to get the Nobel Prize soon in economics, but I don't think they've got it. I think in fact, in the comment on an earlier paper of mine that's sparked this reply of mine in the Scandinavian Economic History Review, Barry admitted that liberalism is greatly underestimated in the history of the West, the liberal idea. So I don't know, I'm still very doubtful that they've got it right.
Hi, thanks for a great talk. I'm a former card-carrying socialist, and so whenever I
am too.
Not anymore.
I am too.
Yeah. So whenever I listen,
deeply sympathize with you.
So whenever I listen to speakers that I'm largely in agreement with, in the back of my mind, I always hear these old objections coming up.
Me too.
And one of the common objections to this idea of equality of opportunity, as I'm sure you're familiar with, is that the liberal conception of equality of opportunity is really just a kind of a mockery of equality of opportunity. Because, for example, if you are the leftist or the socialist, would be inclined to say, if you're truly in favor of people having a go, they have to be not just allowed to have a go, but enabled to have a go.
That's right.
So there's this kind of slip into the kind of positive conception of liberty.
I understand that.
And so what would be the best response from your point of view to this kind of objection?
First is to point out, just as you said, that it's the slippage into the positive notion of liberty. This is Isaiah Berlin in the 1950s, making the distinction between negative liberty, which is the core idea, namely not being under someone else's orders permanently, like a slave. In fact, the word liberal comes from the Latin meaning not a slave. That's all it means, is not a slave. It means a free person. And the positive notion, the third of Franklin Roosevelt's Four Freedoms, in his famous Four Freedoms speech during the Second World War, is freedom from want. And what's happening is that freedom is getting redefined as ability to do stuff, to fly, for example. The ability to fly is not given to humans. And there's, except the flight I'm going to take to Chicago tomorrow, there's no getting around that. And what then it comes to mean is having a high income. If you're rich, then you can, buy another castle. And so you're free. But that's a corruption of the word, and it takes it out of politics and puts it into economics. Now, on the other hand, I completely agree with your former socialist self, because I got the same person inside me, that we have to get serious about equality of opportunity. And let's take one case. Occupational licensure is not freedom of opportunity. You'll notice that economists don't have state licenses. I don't think there's any country where they do, but anyway, certainly not in the United States or in Ireland. And so any Irishman or English or American can set up as an economist. Economic advice, low prices. Anyone here can do that. And that's how it should be. I'm willing to be taxed for state-financed education. State-financed in the sense that they collect taxes from me. But of course, then I want there to be freedom to go to the schools you want to, which now allegedly socialist Sweden has. Since the 1990s, Swedish parents have been free to send their children at state expense to private schools. And that sounds good to me. I'm willing to be coerced for certain things like, well, actually, almost all I'm willing to be coerced for is defense of the realm, when it's really defense of the realm, not 800 American bases around the world defending our freedom by fighting in, some African nation. What the heck are we doing there? But, and so that, in the United States, the big problem would be invasion by the Canadians, which is a constant threat. You have no idea how aggressive they are. So we have a Coast Guard and a small army to stop the Canadians. And then we have a small nuclear force with good missiles to protect us from extortion by the Russians. Pardon me. I'm not actually dying. But I do have this cold. And so I think we got to get serious. Look, one kind of financing of education I'm very much against is state financing of higher education, which I think is a massive subsidy from poor people to the rich, because it's middle class people like me, upper middle class. My father was a professor at Harvard. My mother was an opera singer. Well, I had every advantage. I was ready for college, to put it mildly. Some kid from the barrio is not. I was at the University of California at Riverside for a few months in 2000, And the problem there is they have a lot of Hispanic kids whose family tradition is that you go to work when you graduate from high school. Oh, don't bother with college. Go work for your uncle's lawn mowing firm. And the university admissions people, they're obsessed with trying to get poor people to come to college. And that I'm willing to even be taxed to subsidize, but not to have public educations in Virginia or Michigan or Colorado, that all three of them could be private schools tomorrow, that only the rich kids get to go to because they're ready. So yeah, in fact, that's very interesting that you talk that way, because I have a book that I'm trying to peddle. It's now with the Yale University Press. I hope they publish it. It's called How to Be a Humane Libertarian, Essays in a New Liberalism. Because I want us to stop using the word libertarian. The people on the left in the United States have stopped using the word liberal because the conservatives have made it a swear word. And so we should quickly take it back before they change their minds. Because for over 100 years, the word liberal has been corrupted to mean slow socialism. So that's what we should do. Well, I don't see how I got started on that, but anyway. Aaron Gobrach, right? Aaron, up with Ireland.
So thanks, Deirdre, for coming by to Madrid. I think that we all agree that capitalism works. And one of the best things of the capitalism, I think, is that people don't have to understand it to benefit from it.
Well, that's the trouble, though.
So my question would be, do you think that the bourgeois society is at risk? And if you think...
That is. And that's a very good way of expressing it. It's really easy to understand socialism. One reason it is that we all grow up in families. And families are socialist societies. Particularly if you don't grow up on a farm or a small business. If, like me, you grow up in a professor's house, income falls like manna from heaven. I don't know where it came from. God, he goes to the office. What does that mean? And when the pizza comes, there's equality. Just because he paid for it, he doesn't get all of it. So middle-class kids are really inclined towards socialism at age 16 or 17. And you're right. It's really easy to explain a command economy. I had a colleague at the University of Iowa a long time ago who was asked in the Soviet period to go to an agricultural part of the Soviet Union and explain to them the distribution system for grain, the grain harvest. Because one of the big problems in Soviet communism, among its many, was that they'd harvest a bunch and then it would get lost in the transport or stolen, I don't know. But anyway, it wouldn't make it to market. So they wanted to know about this. So Jerry Nordquist went there. And he told them all about how we have trucks and grain elevators, then we take it to the barges on the Mississippi, or we take it by train, and then it goes to the mills in Minneapolis or wherever it goes. Okay. And they were very interested in that. They said, yeah, but who's the commissar? Who orders it? And he was quite surprised by this. He was an economist. He was startled by this question. He said, well, no one orders it. There's no central planning. And what he found very amusing is they didn't believe him. And they stopped believing anything he said. They said to themselves, he thought, he's concealing a state secret. There's some secret trick that the people in Iowa have for getting the corn harvest in. And of course it's order. Because in a family, mother orders you to do your chores. I mean, come on, how else are they going to happen? Right? So it's the legal mind is very easily convinced that we need constant regulation and supervision. This is a point that Hayek made. Constant regulation and supervision of everything that happens, or else it's all going to be chaos. So they don't believe in the invisible hand. Which keeps me in business, but, you know, I wish they believe. But here's another argument we can use. Would you like to have central planning of art or science? To some degree we do, but let's suppose we had complete central planning of science or of, art or music, rock music. There's a commissar of rock music, which would tell you what developments we need to make in making music that sounds like an airplane crash, as to my mind, modern rock music does. But okay, you see, and then we say, we make the analogy with the economy, because it's an art. Most people are not good musicians, great musicians, or painters, or scholars, or scientists, but many people can exercise their creativity in their job. It's wonderful to watch someone on the buses in Chicago. Usually the drivers are somewhat polite, but not very. Every once in a while, you find a bus driver who invites you onto his bus and is cheerful and helpful. And this is a man who's having a happy life. He's doing his job in a graceful, helpful, excited way. It's wonderful to behold. And that's what a free economy affords. Make us into slaves of the state. We no longer have that. Sorry to give these little inspiring speeches, but
Well, that's really inspiring, actually. Congratulations on a beautiful talk, and without PowerPoint.
No, PowerPoint is evil. Stop using PowerPoint. Stand and deliver. What you can use, the only thing you can use PowerPoint for is pictures. That's what it's good at.
I also identify a lot with what you said, because when I grew up in South America, I was a communist. Everybody, every good boy and good girl in the 60s, 70s, 80s, we were all communists.
Of course.
And then, my parents left to Spain, so I grew up in South America. They left because of Franco, and I left Venezuela because of Chavez. And then I went to the USA, and then I left because of Trump. I hope not to live here because of Podemos.
Yes.
But I'm actually presenting a book in 2 weeks about the advances of biotechnology to be able to rejuvenate people and to have indefinite lifespans. And basically, we have 2 major enemies. The people who totally disregard this technology, don't know what is happening, and they call us crazy, this is impossible, we are charlatans. And then we have the socialists. The socialists,
really?
Yes, they oppose these technologies because they say they will be very expensive and only the wealthy people will have access to them. So these are the 2 enemies, the people who are not aware of the technologies and the socialists, who are also ignorant. But
I know exactly what you mean. And there's a shocking passage, again in Hayek. I give the impression that I'm a deep student of Hayek, but I'm not. But I came across this amazing argument of his that the rich do the rest of the society a good deed by being pioneers in consumption. I thought, Jesus, that's kind of a cheesy argument. What, you're supposed to subsidize the rich so they can have fancy stuff that we... Well, But when you think about it as an economic historian, it makes a lot of sense. Take the bicycle, which was invented as a toy for rich young men, and very rich because they were very expensive. And they kept being very expensive, and then they invented the air tire, the pneumatic tire, which, by the way, caused a boom in rubber in Brazil. Okay. The bicycle got cheaper and cheaper, and then became the instrument of the economic improvement of the working class. Because you could drive further to a job, you could drive further to shop, you weren't in the hands of monopolies or monopsonies, we say in economics, as much as you were. In fact, transport costs in general have caused monopoly since 1800 to fall dramatically, contrary to what you and I learned when we were socialists, which is that monopoly is getting bigger and bigger. No, it's not. It's getting less and less because of transport and communication costs falling like a stone. So I see what you mean, but it keeps happening. There was originally a great outcry on the left against what's it called, Wi-Fi, but for a whole city. They said no, only the rich have smartphones. But now every poor person in the United States has a smartphone because they've gone down in price. In Africa, they didn't have to lay cables because they moved to cell phones instantly.
And rejuvenation technologies specifically? Do you have any thoughts?
I don't have any opinions about them because I'm completely ignorant. But I'd like to live forever if I could live the way I was when I was 30. Now I've had both hips replaced, and I'm afraid I'm going to have my damn knees replaced. But no, I don't want to make a comment about it. But I don't see that it's a terrible thing. It'd be all right.
Yes, here. So thank you very much. Such a pleasure. I would like to ask you just about intellectual property and licenses.
Hold the microphone close to your mouth. Think of rock musicians.
It's worked. So I would like to ask you about intellectual property and the licenses. So how the government get involved in the market. So maybe creating a monopolistic market, and maybe this is forbidden, making limitation in innovation and the freedom of people. So the system of licenses.
In fact, Matsukato argues the other way. She said she has this stupid book. Pardon me. I shouldn't. I'm supposed to be a scholar. This mistaken book called the Entrepreneurial State, where she says that if you've had any help at all from the government, your innovation is caused by the government. So if you had a fellowship when you were in graduate school and you invented something, then it's the state. But I think mainly the state is an obstacle to innovation. And what people will say, they get very confused about that. They'll say war is a source of innovation. Well, war is a source of innovation in the technology of killing people, I admit that. But, and then there's a Tang fallacy, which older economists talk about. Tang was a horrible artificial orange drink that the astronauts were going to use. And this was one of the great spin-offs of the space program. Tang, it was called. It was just awful. So, no, I don't think the state is it's certainly not a good chooser of winners. The disastrous $500 million that the United States government loaned to the firm making solar panels, an American firm, the Chinese got better. So, of course, Donald Trump's idea is to put a tariff on Chinese solar panels. is that responsive to your question? I'm not sure it is. Yeah. So anyway, I think that, look, on its face, although we've grown accustomed to thinking of the government as being very active in industrial policy and so forth, on its face, the idea that you or me, if we were bureaucrats in Washington or Madrid, the idea that we would be good judges of whether or not to put a wind farm here or there is crazy. Why would we be any good at that? The people on the site are pledging their incomes and their sacred honor on getting this right. They have every incentive to get it right. And the people in the central government, they're not bad people. I have cousins who work for the CIA, and I'm sure they are nice people. Not sure the CIA is so nice, but I think they are. So it's not that they're evil, it's just that it's kind of unreasonable to expect that they would know how to do it. And actually, again, that's Hayek. As he pointed out in his, really what's his most important paper, what did he call it, The Nature of Knowledge or something? 1945. It's a terrific paper, which every serious student of society should read. And he says, now look, how does any central planner know what you want in terms of a raincoat? Maybe it's better to let us all assemble our local knowledge for the benefit of others, and with a commercial test. Commercial test. I mean, look, again, let's talk about high-speed rail in Spain. This is insane. But some politician wanted it. Yes.
Hi. Thank you for such great talk. I have two questions, if I may.
Yeah.
Is that okay? All right. First one, I do really struggle with that notion, liberal idea that we should be concerned about poverty rather than redressing inequality. Now, my question is,
you mean you want to worry about equality?
Not really. I mean, I think they are interrelated. I think they are connected. I don't understand why we should be concerned about poverty and not about redressing inequality. I think.
Okay, but suppose I answer that very briefly.
Yeah.
Equality in itself is not a sensible ethical purpose, whereas raising up poor people is. So I'd rather turn your presumption around. Inequality, I don't care if Liliane Bettencourt, the heiress to the L'Oreal fortune, I think she died, but was an incredible jerk. She was a terrible person, and didn't give any money to the poor, and really I hated her. But I didn't care that she had another yacht. It didn't matter to me. What does matter to me is the poorest people in the society should be raised up. And what we unfortunately call capitalism does that very efficiently.
How do you square the fact that with a limited resources and an exponential growing population, how can they not be, there must be a connection there, surely.
You believe
because
in
it's accumulation of capital, it's accumulation of resources. That will hinder.
You've read too much of Thomas Piketty. I have a 50-page review of him on my website.
I've read it. Yeah.
Well, you read it, then you didn't agree with it then, but you got to read some of my other stuff on Malthus, because the problem is not population growth. The population of the world will go up to about 10 billion and then start falling.
In Spain, it is already...
Oh, in Italy it's falling. In most European countries it's falling. It's not in the United States because of immigration, but the fool we have as a president wants to stop that too. He said, he makes a Ricardian point, David Ricardo, and a Malthusian point, and a Marxist point, that resources are limited, and in population, if it increases, will impoverish the poor. And they'll make for inequality. And it's just wrong. But no, he's got another question. And that's just wrong. It hasn't worked out that way. The poor are the main beneficiaries of this factor of 30. Look, the rich only got another diamond bracelet. Well, great. Betancourt has another yacht. That's swell. But the poor, my Irish ancestors or my Norwegian ancestors, my English ancestors, were unspeakably poor. And now Ireland is rich, United States is rich, Norway is very rich. This bothers the Swedes quite a lot. So it's not worked out that way. This Malthusian argument is incorrect. But anyway, what's your second
Which
question?
leads me to the next question. One of the causes of this enrichment, great enrichment that he mentioned before, was innovation. Now, I'd like to bring...
Oh, the only cause was innovation.
No. It was one of the driving force, so to speak.
It was the cause.
Yeah.
That's what I mean by cause.
Yeah. But one of the causes.
There's no other factor.
Yeah, okay, fair cause. Okay, right. Fair enough. I'd like to bring into the room a quote from another scholar, Steve King, Post-Keynesian. He says that the reason why we have this great enrichment, like you said, is innovation, but because engineers have innovated, engineers have speculated, rather than financiers, speculation. Now, my question is, how do you square the fact that if in the past few years we haven't had enrichment, or we haven't had enlargement of the pie, neither redistribution of the pie, precisely because there's been a lot of innovation in financial markets.
You're bothered by that.
How do you square that with the fact that you say that envy-driven policies from institutions will hinder growth, economic growth, etc.? Surely, in this case, this innovation, this freedom that liberals like.
Well, so you're bothered by financial innovation, and I say you're wrong. I say that financial innovation is innovation. Now, you're right that certain government policies, especially in the United States, distorted grossly the financing. My brother, John, is poor. He works as a janitor. He's retired now, but he worked as a janitor. He had a problem with alcohol. He's smarter than I am, but he had this other problem. John, in 2006, got a no down payment mortgage on a house. And I'm supposed to be an economist. I should have said, John got a mortgage? Huh? I should have said there is something dramatically wrong with housing financing in the United States. And a year later, I was proved right. No, I wasn't proved right. I didn't think it at the time. I just said, gee, John, so what we did is we bought his house for him, my mother and sister and I. But, but that's not financial innovation that's causing the problem. When something makes money, it's not because you're being ripped off. It's because some of your fellow citizens are willing to pay for it. And my friends on the left have to stop thinking that profit is like a tax. It's not. It's a signal. It's not the incentive effects. That's what the left thinks we argue. It's not the incentive that Steve Jobs is incentivized if he makes another $1,000. He's too rich for that to bother. But it's a signal. And if we don't let the economy send these signals, or if we distort them, as we did with the housing market in the United States, then we're going to get disasters. Read beyond the post-Keynesians. I was once a Keynesian. I am a post-Keynesian, if what it means is after Keynes. After you've gotten over Keynes, walk without Keynes.
So Deirdre, I wanted to ask you about the role of intellectuals. You've mentioned Schumpeter lots of time, and as you know, he made this point of how capitalism would somehow be destroyed by too much of our intellectual work against the system,
Say.
and some sort of tiredness that comes with all the
Yep.
creative destruction. And whenever I'm reading one of your books, I keep thinking and keep going back to Schumpeter a lot. Happens a lot to me, and I see several parallels with that. So what's your take on that? Because it does seem like there is a big intellectual wave against the market. Maybe it's because we're young, but we seem to perceive it like this. And anyway, we go back a few years, decades, and it seems like the same complaint was there. So
Yeah.
what role are intellectuals playing, and what do you
Well,
think?
I just wrote a long essay about Schumpeter. If you can think of a place to publish it, tell me. Because the place that asked me to write the paper, I'm very annoyed with it, then turned it down. So this is a bait and switch. Speaking of being cheated by bosses, that's it. But anyway, I think about Schumpeter personally, he was always making jokes. He loved paradox. So this idea that capitalism would raise up its own grave diggers was one that he just loved with this ironical turn of his. In fact, he protected himself from criticism by making ironic jokes. So his book that we're talking about, Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy, 1942, is popular on the left and the right and the middle. Everyone loves this book. At the time, it didn't make much of a splash, but it's never been out of print since 1942. I wish I could assure that with my books. Because you can kind of take anything you want from Schumpeter. You can take the pessimistic case that capitalism is doomed, but his idea of doom is that it's replaced by socialism, which that's doom for him. That doesn't sound like a socialist message, that socialism is doom. But he had a lot to say, as you said, about the role of intellectuals in all this, which I admire. And in the paper, I praise him for it. I say that Schumpeter gets that ideas matter. Now, what he didn't account for is that capitalism, had a lot left in it. In 1942, look, you were a communist in your youth. I would have been a communist in the 1930s. Who wouldn't? You'd have to be intellectually dead not to be a communist in the 1930s, because it looked like capitalism was on its last legs. This reaction to capitalism recently is a result of the 2008 catastrophe. It's a result of American housing policy. And we'll get over it, I think. Because the demonstration effect is gigantic. Whatever the intellectuals say, China and India are growing like mad. And that's 40% of humankind. And they're growing because they adopted liberal economic formulas. Now, China's got a problem that it's highly illiberal in politics. So I don't know what quite is going to happen there. But in India, I'm very optimistic. So I'm not sure I'm being responsive to your question, but the clerisy, as I call them in my books, have always been a problem from 1848 on. They're the ones who killed liberalism in England and the United States by adopting the word, taking it over, but for advocating socialism. So a liberal in the United States is, as I said before, a slow socialist. What to do? All we can do is preach, write books.
Here.
Yes,
it's been a pleasure meeting you and listening to you. And basically, the two topics that you have spoken about are the first one, the virtues of changing attitudes in society.
Yeah.
Actually, for me, it would have been clearer to say which were the enemies of the new virtues or the new attitudes. And basically, it was the warriors, the soldiers,
yes,
and the church, the
and
priests.
The priests.
The only way the old way of being virtuous was being a hero, a military
Exactly.
hero, or give your life to God.
That's right.
Okay. And then we, the merchant classes and the workers were low status. They were nobody. They have no power. And of course, the other ones had the power. They didn't want them to replace them. So this change has been very, very fruitful because we have stopped killing each other, the warriors, and also the power of the church, which is based a lot of it in superstition and deceit, was also overcome by science, technology, or other cultural advances.
Well, I don't quite agree on that, but let's agree to disagree on that point.
Sure. I mean,
I'm an Anglican.
This is a very brief summary. I mean, of course.
Okay, yeah.
Then I'm not an expert at all in your research about the factors that contributed to the huge explosion in productivity.
Yeah.
But anyway, when you say, okay, 30-fold seems like impossible.
I know it does.
I'm sure you have done the numbers. When you have exponential growth, just the growth of 10% per year can add up to a lot. So if you have done the numbers and it doesn't, okay.
Very quickly.
Then also, I think that a sensible person who defends capital as a factor will not say only something as simple as throw more machines of it.
Yeah.
Build more hammers. It will. I mean, an intelligent capitalist will say, build better capital. I mean,
Well,
produce
that's
better
right.
capital, and
No, I
that's of
agree
course
with
that's based in innovation. The
agree.
idea of innovation is of course.
But that's right.
Mhm.
It is innovation.
Okay. Then the problem I see with innovation is one has been already introduced. Innovation can be bad. I mean,
Bad.
you can do, when you do new things, you don't know what you are doing. Otherwise, they are not really new. And you fail most of the time.
Yep.
So innovation can cause problems.
Yep.
Also, most people are not able to really innovate
That's right.
in a productive way. So innovation is like the realm of a chosen few, very, very important people. What does the rest of society do? Copy, reproduce.
Well, and it has to not attack them.
Sure,
Look, I think every human population, maybe there are variations, but every human population has about 10%, maybe 5% of innovators.
Sure.
It's just that in the era of the church and the court, they innovated in that or in war.
Sure. I mean, it is extremely important what you say, that let them work and copy them if you want and ignore them.
But
if
yeah,
you-
but
if you
the
want. Sure.
but the copying is very important because it's entry. It prevents monopoly. There's been there's an excellent paper by Bill Nordhaus at Harvard where he calculates what the social gain from innovation has been in the United States since the war, roughly, and what percentage of the gain has gone to the innovators, to the inventors. And it's only 2%. 2%. That is, we get 98% of the gain. And Walton, of Walmart, gets the 2%. Well, that makes their children immensely wealthy.
That's
But
a very interesting
so what?
debate about intellectual property, whether it is necessary or not, whether
I don't
we
like-
can get rid of it completely. I think that
I don't
getting
like-
rid of it completely might be a bit.
But the problem with intellectual property, and there's a lot of people who think they're liberal, who are in favor of it, is that it's so subject to political intervention. The famous example is the Mickey Mouse Protection Act, as economists and some lawyers call it. The copyright on Mickey Mouse was to expire in 1998. So the Walt Disney Company went to Congress and purchased it. Well, they made contributions to political campaigns for a surprisingly small sum. And Congress increased the copyright, which already was, hear this, 50 years after the death of the creator. So 50 years after Walt Disney's death. They raised it to 70 years for everybody. Now, that's insane. If we could be sure that patents and copyrights would go for 10 years, say, choose a number. It's a hopeless economic problem. Because after the idea is made, copying it should be free, socially speaking. You somehow have to encourage the original idea, but you can't give Shakespeare's heirs the copyright to the plays and every performance for 4 centuries. It makes no sense. You've got to speak, but the trouble is the politics comes in and they change it. So I'm against, I've become very radical about this. I don't like the idea of intellectual property at all.
That opens a very interesting debate that would take just 2 more small points and coming back to the present and connecting again with the virtues. Regarding energy and coal, engineers, and I am a physicist, know that it's not only energy defined in the abstract, but you need a machine to be able to use that energy. You can have all the coal in the world, that if you don't have an external internal combustion energy, that coal is useless.
That's a very good point, because
we have all the fusion or fission energy we want, but you need a nuclear reactor.
And indeed, the efficiency in the physicist sense, the engineer's sense of the early steam engines was very low. And in the 19th century, things like steam turbines, what's the other one that the reusing of the steam to extract more of the energy, they got, I think it's up to 80% or some astonishingly high figure, and it's 10% in the first steam engines. So you're right, there's ideas. Observe. Engineers had to figure this out. They had and the idea then resulted in the compound engines is what I'm thinking of, which were especially important in steam ships. But ideas had to precede. Yeah, that's right. But that's another way of attacking.
It was an innovation, but it was an innovation about a very important topic, which is how much energy is available.
That's
how much
right.
Energy
available energy is what matters.
We can use.
Yeah, of course.
And then your criticism of institutionalism is a bit unfair, I can understand, in the sense that institutions include formal institutions, but also informal institutions.
Yeah, but you understand.
The formal ones are just the laws. But the informal ones are the ones you are defending.
Yeah, but you understand the scientific problem there. Mm-hmm. You know, actually, energy is a good example, because how physicists define energy is absolutely crucial. And if you define it too broadly, well, actually, I shouldn't challenge you in physics. It's a big mistake. Well, let's take, look, that's what I meant by saying, if you define institutions too broadly, then it's vacuous.
Yeah, it's all of culture.
It's all of culture. And you say, well, culture matters, which some people do, like David Landis. And the trouble with that is that cultures change remarkably quickly. Spain went through a culture change after the death of Franco. Spanish universities, I noticed it at the time, were enormously inspirited when they were freed of fascism, of the fascist regime. And they got better. Wouldn't you agree? Mm-hmm. So anyway, ideas are the thing. And you've given me another way of attacking my friend Ridley.
I love Matt Ridley.
He's a great guy.
His books.
He's a Viscount.
I know.
And we were.
He owns coal.
He owns coal. And we were walking down the staircase in the House of Lords one day. I want to drop that just in case you didn't know that I walked down staircases in the House of Lords. And he was saying, I was on TV the other night, and there was this guy from the left who was attacking me because I was a coal baron. Coal baron, which is a sneer word for anyone who owns coal mines, and he does own coal mines. And his family is rich because they own underground coal mines. Now they just do surface. And he, with a smile, he said, I'm not a baron, I'm a viscount, which is above a baron. One step, I have to say, above a baron. He's not a duke. But he said, that wouldn't have worked on TV. It's like, well, you don't give me sufficient dignity. I'm a viscount. That wouldn't have worked. He's a very amusing man.
And back to the beginning, I guess you know the work of Michael Sandel.
Yeah, I do. I've got a review of Michael Sandel. Well, and I take him to pieces, I have to say. Oy vey. This is a terrible book. This guy's supposed to be a scholar and he doesn't tell the kids what the philosophy is.
I mean, the funny thing is that the same way that the church and the warriors pretended or insisted that they were the virtuous one, the interventionists or the social democrats or socialists now say they are the virtuous one and we're the bad ones because we want to open some relationships to the possibility of commercial exchange. We don't want to force anyone, but we at least want to open that possibility. And he's always saying that no, that we are opening the door too much and that some things should be completely
out of commerce.
Out of market.
And I agree. I don't think we should buy and sell children. Although anyone who's been a parent of teenagers wishes there was a second-hand market. So anyway, yes, Sandel, again, as in the case of my review of Piketty, I tried to start the book being fair. I didn't read any of the other reviews of Piketty before writing mine. And I haven't read any since then, to tell you the truth. And I just read the book. It's a great project, whereas Sandel's is not such a great project. But anyway, I tried to read Sandel's book fairly. And I was simply appalled by how superficial it is. His basic argument, he's got two arguments, that the market isn't fair. Well, it's really not fair if you've got governments captured by monopolists, powerful governments that prevent it from being fair, and that the market is, for some things, immoral and vulgar. And I agree. I don't think we should allow to people to sell themselves into slavery. I think it ought to be against the law. And we shouldn't sell children. But he makes this an argument against, I don't know, Milton Friedman or something. It's silly. Freedom. Liberty.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, dears.
Tomorrow she's flying back to Chicago, so thank you for everyone. And well, for the rest, see you on our next conference, which will be hosted after vacations. And just let's go outside and defend freedom. Thank you very much.